let's start with this question about who shapes laws. So obviously our first thing is legislature. Right? Legislators are supposed to make laws, sure. They sign that law, they debate that law in parliament, and then it gets done. But the legislature is not the only force that makes laws. Right? So you've got the legislature, the bureaucracy, which implements the law, but which is also something that probably produces the first draft of the law, suggests the law. The cabinet, obviously, the final authority of government to take the law to its stage, obviously has a major role. But what do you think of media, NGOs, corporates, international organizations? Not to get away from the political party structures, which are not necessarily either the cabinet or the legislature themselves, but probably more politically forceful than the other parts. And of course, judiciary. So when you look at the 9 laws that we look at, and I'm going to give you a list in a couple of minutes, you'll find that in many of these cases, the real fillip for the lawmaking came from certain landmark judgments. And it's the judiciary that has played a very important role in pushing forth the agenda of lawmaking in a particular area. So let me start off with giving you the list of 9 laws that we are looking at. So we looked at the Competition Act, we looked at RTI, RTE, Right to Information and Right to Education, the Child Labor Bill, which, as I mentioned, subsequently passed, but it was not passed at that point. The Microfinance Bill, which came to the table, did not get passed, at least during that window. Food Security Act, Lokpal Act, Land Acquisition Act, and the Criminal Laws Act, Criminal Laws Amendment Act, which is in the wake of the Nirbhaya episode. So we looked at these 9 cases and we tried to follow the entire evolution and trajectory of the legislation over several years, several decades. You know, when you think of making a law, it is a continuing story, just like history. It doesn't necessarily have a very clear point from which you say, okay, on such and such date, the journey for this law started. It's difficult to say that. There's not a clear break. Most laws that you talk about are intense. They're in the minds of some people going back probably to the independence or earlier. And then they slowly shape into whatever you see coming out of the legislature several decades down the road. So we have to make a judgment call and say, well, this is what we consider is the starting point of this movement, which ultimately led to this law. Subject to that arbitrariness, it is interesting to take a look at the variability of time that it took for some laws to come into existence and the quickness with which certain laws came into being. So for all of you who remember the Nirbhaya episode, I would like to point out then that the Criminal Laws Act, post that horrendous crime that took place, in less than 4 months, government constituted a committee, went through the entire discussion, engaged with several women's groups, took their feedback, processed the information, put it in parliament, and actually in 4 months' time, the amendment was done. Now compare that to anything in this list. Let's say Food Security Act, right, which is a pretty young movement, I would say, right? And that's about 21 years old, right, before it actually saw 21 years in the pre-legislative and 1.9, so that's 2 years there, 23 years it takes to get there. The Lokpal Act depends on when you want to time it from. The latest movement was about 5 years to get to the act stage, but if you go back to the original Lokpal issue, that was sometime in the early 70s and that period, so you can even call that a 3-decade-long, 4-decade-long movement. So it depends on what you want to call the birth. So the point of this slide is that the range of social movements or activism or advocacy producing actual legislative effect can be hugely varied. It can be as short as 3 months, it can be as long as 25 years, quarter century, and you don't produce the desired action, desired result. So the question it therefore begs is, why is it that some laws get done quickly, and why is it that some laws seem to take forever to go anywhere? It's obviously a very long story, and there can be many alternative ways of looking at this. It's a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional story. So there's no one right way of saying, okay, this is the way you think about this. This is the prism through which you should be looking at the question. But the approach that we take, and after having run through the standard existing political questions, political theories, which did not seem to do the job for us, what we found is we did a very simple 2x2 matrix and tried to see the nature of activism. So when do activists collaborate with government? When do activists conflict with government? What is the tone of advocacy that you follow? Do you work with the government? That's what we are calling collaborative here. And do you go straight on the warpath and take government head on to push your point? That's what we are calling conflictual. So the red marks there are conflictual movements, what we consider conflictual in the nature of the movement that took place. And the blue ones are collaborative. On the government side also, the reaction, the openness to engage with non-elected participants differ from case to case. So there are times when government is more cooperative and more listening, more open to engage in a conversation with non-elected participants. And there are times when government is completely closed for whatever reasons, political reasons, the mood of the nation, the whole perceived legitimacy or lack thereof of non-elected people to talk on issues as representing a general voice, whatever may be the reason. Sometimes government also becomes confrontational. I wouldn't call it conflictual. It doesn't get into a conflict because it is in the winner's seat anyway. It's holding the power. So it becomes confrontational, and sometimes government is cooperative. Now this combination of advocacy activism styles by the champion of the laws between collaborative and conflictual, and the government's attitude, cooperative with confrontational, may actually have an impact on the amount of time it takes, which is there in the third column here, to get the legislative agenda to include this particular legislation that is in question. However, even there, you don't find a very clear pattern. It's not to say that, well, let's say the microfinance bill. The means of activism was collaborative. Microfinance organizations didn't take to streets, didn't burn effigies, didn't do major marches, didn't shout for resignations of government people or anything like that. And government was by and large cooperative. Even then, it has not gotten done in about 20 years of talks. So it's not like cooperative attitudes always produce results. And there are times when you can get the government to capitulate. Let's say the Lokpal Act, for example, conflictual, confrontational, and yet something got done in a short period of time. This is not to try to say that this was right and that was wrong, or this is good or this is bad. I'm just trying to put down the resulting time that it took to, as a result of the, in relation to the styles adopted by both parties in the process. This puts the same story in a slightly, in a graphical manner. The difference, and if I may go back to the previous slide for a second, those bullet holes that you see in this picture, that's what that refers to are these external triggers. As you can see, the Criminal Laws Act and the Lokpal Act had external triggers. Now, what do we mean by external triggers? Well, the Nirbhaya incident was an external trigger. Something happens in the environment which just produces an effect which simply would not have taken place through the gradual advocacy that the owners of that cause pushed with the government. It just changes the rules of the game and produces a law as quickly as in 4 months' time. So external triggers play a massive role in hastening, accelerating the legislative agenda. But so when you talk about the styles of the two parties, that and you have to be seen in light of the external triggers. So the last thing that I'm going to stop with here is a sense that if you're trying to make a sense of the legislative process, of this collaborative structure where different stakeholders come together to make laws, well, it is something that is called a complex process. This picture, and I would ask you to go and take a look at it later, is a famous Stacey diagram, which shows that most of the action in lawmaking happens when the right thing to do is uncertain and the degree of agreement between different players is not too much. And that's where most of the real politics behind lawmaking takes place. Thank you very much.